you're going to start moving into things that are a little more intensive, you have Lafroig. That's commonly available. In fact, I buy that for $30 a bottle at Costco. One of the best Islay style. Now understand, that is the opposite end of Glenlivet, like polar opposite. That's really intense, smoky, medicinal, heavy Scotch. But it's a great Scotch. It's 10-year-old. Glenmorangie. Glenmorangie is another classic, light-bodied, orangey, fruity, really great overall Scotch that you can buy. Still selling for in the $35 range. It's really great. Then, of course, you get up into the higher end ones, like you mentioned, Talisker. Very extremely high quality, very intense, complex Scotch. Lagavulin 16, that's another one that's been around for a long time. That's very, very high end. Well, yeah, and I think this is a good rule of thumb when it comes to whiskey in general. There is a correlation, not necessarily a cause and effect, but a correlation between quality and price.
Like tequila.
Yeah, in many ways, it's like, I think it's actually even more so in tequila. Scotch kind of goes like this. At the cheap end, it's way down there. You get into the middle, and that's where 80% of the quality lies, is in the middle. And then as you start moving up, you're paying for aging, you're paying for rarity, and that sort of thing. I've never found the difference between a $200 bottle of Scotch and a $2,000 bottle of Scotch to be worth the price difference. I mean, I've had Macallan 25, which sells for $500 a shot, and I've had Macallan 18. Yeah, the Macallan 25 is undescribably fantastic, but so is the Macallan 18. And for $400 per shot difference, there's not enough difference to buy the 25.
So when you say 80% of the quality lies in a certain area, what price point are you talking from this point to this point?
Well, I would say that
25.
When you hit about $30, from $30 up, you're starting to get into the generally good, better quality whiskeys. By the time you hit $40 to $50 a bottle, you are consistently hitting high quality whiskeys.
Okay. Gotcha.
When you get above that, between that and 100, you're almost guaranteed you're going to have a high quality whiskey, because they won't stay in business long enough if they don't provide that. Once you get over $100, you're starting to get into some rare, more rarefied territory. And yes, there are some whiskeys that are in the $100 to $300, even $400 bottle range that are sublime. There's just nothing to compare it to. But once you get past that, you're getting into collectible range. And then it's really a matter of, you personally, it's sort of, I guess the best way to describe it is, do I want to buy a Porsche or a Lamborghini? Well, I don't know whether, that's a personal thing. Is there really that much of a difference? If you can afford to buy a Lamborghini, you can afford to buy a bottle of Macallan 25. But do you need a bottle of Macallan 25? Maybe not.
Could you just briefly just take us through the basics of, what is a single malt? What is a blend in layman's terms?
In the world of Scotch, and actually in Irish whiskey too, but we'll focus on Scotch. There's 4 main types of Scotch: single malt, single grain, blended malt, and blended. So we'll start with single malt. Single malt means that it's made 100% from malted barley from a single distillery. So a single malt whiskey, contrary to popular belief, is not a single grain. What a single malt whiskey is a 100% malted barley whiskey where all the whiskeys in the bottle come from one distillery. So the term single means the number of distilleries blended in the bottle.
And there's only barley used?
That's right. So 100% barley, that's the term malt, malted barley. So single malt is a malted whiskey. It can be a blend, but it has to all be malted whiskey from 100% barley, and it has to come from only one distillery.
Okay.
Which actually brings me to the age statement. Most aged whiskeys are not aged that number of years, though the number of years on the bottle represents the youngest whiskey in the bottle. Most single malt whiskeys are actually blends of multiple years and multiple malts from one distillery. That's an important understanding that'll set us up for the other three types.
So if, for example, it says 12-year-old on a bottle of Scotch, and let's say for argument's sake they use 3 different whiskeys to blend it, then one of the whiskeys could be 12 years old, one could be 15 years old, one could be 30 years old.
Correct.
But they're going with the age of the youngest whiskey in that blend.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's number one. Now, the second category of malt whiskey, again, 100% from malted barley, is what's called blended malt, or it used to be called vatted malt. A blended malt whiskey is 100% barley, malted barley whiskey, but it's blended from whiskeys from different distilleries.
That are also malted barley whiskeys.
Right. So they all have to be the same source, malted barley whiskeys, but they can be from any region or any distillery from Scotland.
Okay.
I'm going to interject too. The whole purpose of calling Scotch Scotch is it has to be distilled, aged, and bottled in Scotland. So that's an underlying factor of this. It also, all Scotch has to be aged a minimum of 3 years in wood before it can be bottled and called Scotch. All right, so now we're going to move forward from there to the lowest level, which is grain whiskey. Grain whiskey is whiskey made from anything that is not malted barley. So primarily it's made with wheat, green barley, but it can be also made from corn and other grains. And grain whiskey is primarily used as a blending tool. Grain whiskeys tend to be very much lighter in flavor, much less intense. And back in the 1800s, when the still was created that could make whiskey from those grains, they started blending it with the heavier malts so that they can make a more approachable whiskey. So blenders will blend grain whiskey with malt whiskey to get exactly the flavor profile that they're looking for. Now, there's a new kind of a newer phenomenon called single grain Scotch. You mentioned that earlier. A single grain Scotch is pure grain whiskey with no malted barley, all from one distillery.
And what kind of grains are typically used?
The most common is going to be non-malted barley, but it can be made from corn. It can be made from wheat.
Any grain.
Any grain, technically, that's correct.
But if it's single grain, does that mean it's only made with one type of grain?
The term single only means that it's from one distillery.
Okay, got you.
So that's a common misconception. And so it can be a blend of different grains.
But a single distillery.
Blended grain whiskey is just not very common. Now, there are some blended whiskeys that use very little malt in them, and they're mostly grain, and you can taste those. I would venture to say, the grocery store brand scotches that you go in there and it's, Joe's Piper, or, it's the whatever the store brand is of whiskey. Those are usually very grain-heavy whiskeys, and they tend to be very simple, not very complex. And in general, in my humble opinion, not very good. But I'll give you an example. A company called Compass Box makes a 100% blended grain whiskey called Hedonism. That's one of the highest rated whiskeys of its type. There are some really good grain whiskeys out there. They're just primarily used for blending.
Are grains cheaper to use than barley?
Much. The process is cheaper. They can for every gallon of barley-based whiskey that they make in pot stills, they can make 20 or more of grain whiskey in a column still.
Okay.
So it's faster, it's cheaper, and it's much lighter, but it's not as complex, and it's usually not as good.
Okay, gotcha.
It's the perfect thing besides water to blend with malts to get an exact flavor profile.
Got you.
They tend to be more like herbal and fruitier and lighter. And I use the word marshmallow a lot in terms of that kind of. It's kind of a generically sweeter, but without a lot of complexity.
So single grain whiskeys are typically used for blending. Is that right?
Well, no, single grain whiskeys are generally sold as single grain because it's a specialty.
Oh.
But grain whiskey in general is used to blend. And you can use all the grain from one distillery to make a blended whiskey, but it's not required.
Kind of like in wine, there are certain grapes that are usually used for blending, and you don't see them on their own too often just because they're usually not great.
Right. I mean, it's like mixing Cabernet Franc with a little bit of Cabernet Franc in your Cabernet Sauvignon to soften it and give it a little more earthiness.
Okay, got you.
Although Cabernet Franc is a great red wine in and of itself,
right?
It was originally used primarily as a blending ingredient.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching. Again, Mr. Steve Kirwan, thank you. Thank you so much for being so generous to share your knowledge with us, and I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome, Kurt. I appreciate it.